breaking news. Major developments in the Nancy Guthrie case. Late today, the sheriff in Pima County, Arizona, releasing redacted versions of 2 ransom notes. The mother of Today Show host Savannah Guthrie, taken from her home in Tucson exactly 6 months ago. The first note sent to a local TV station saying, quote, "We have your mother," and adding she is safe but scared. The writer demanding $4 million in Bitcoin. The second note received days later claiming Nancy Guthrie, quote, "perished shortly after she was taken." The writer claiming we never intended to hurt her. This comes 24 hours after we learned new details about DNA found at the scene.
I have nothing to indicate she's dead. I don't have a body. I don't have a burial site. I don't have any note. Those were the words of Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos. Said on camera. Said to CBS News. Said like a man closing a door. 24 hours later, his own department opened it back up. "Hello Savannah, we have your mother. She is safe but scared." That's not something I'm paraphrasing for effect. That's the first line of a note the sheriff's office released to the public. The same note the same sheriff had just told a national news audience didn't exist. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, co-anchor of the Today Show. She was last seen alive in her own home outside Tucson, Arizona, on the night of January 31st. By the next morning she was gone. No forced entry the family has spoken of. No trail. No answers. Just an empty house, and a silence that would stretch on for 6 months. And somewhere in that silence someone was writing. Twice. The first message arrived 4 days after Nancy vanished, addressed directly to her daughter by name. It didn't read like a rumor or a hoax, or a prank pulled from a stranger's imagination. It read like someone who had been inside that house. Someone who knew what was sitting on the floor beside her bed. Someone who knew what was broken outside her back door. 4 days later, a second message arrived. And whatever this was, extortion, confession, cruelty, it changed shape completely. The money disappeared from the conversation entirely. What replaced it was something colder. 2 notes. 4 days apart. One family still waiting for their mother to come home. And a sheriff who stood in front of cameras and said there was nothing, the day before his own office proved otherwise. So here's where we start. Not with theories. Not with speculation. With exactly what was said, exactly who said it, and the 24 hours that don't add up. Because before we get to what's inside those 2 notes, and there is a lot inside those 2 notes, you need to sit with this contradiction first. He said he didn't have a note. He had 2. Let's back up. Because to understand why 2 contradicting notes matter so much, you have to understand exactly who Nancy Guthrie was before any of this happened. She was 84. She lived in her own home near Tucson, Arizona, independent, by all accounts sharp, close with her 3 children, Savannah, Annie, and Cameron. Savannah, most people recognize instantly. She co-anchors NBC's Today Show, a familiar face to millions of people who had never once thought they'd see her family's name attached to a case like this. On the night of January 31st, Nancy was seen at home. Nothing unusual. Nothing that, in hindsight, anyone has pointed to as a warning sign. And then, sometime in those early morning hours, everything changed. By February 1st, she was reported missing. No note left behind, not then. No sign of where she'd gone. Just an 84-year-old woman who had been there one night and wasn't there the next morning. Investigators moved fast. Within days, the FBI stepped in, and this stopped being treated as a wellness check or a wandering elderly case. It became a kidnapping investigation. That classification matters. It tells you what law enforcement believed early about what they were dealing with. Not a woman who left on her own. A woman who was taken. Here's a detail that's easy to skip past, and you shouldn't. Nancy had a heart condition. She wore a pacemaker, a small device that, among other things, stays in contact with her phone. And in the early hours of that night, sometime around 2:30 in the morning, that connection broke. The pacemaker went out of range of her phone. Sit with that for a second. That's not a witness account. That's not a theory someone floated on the news. That's a machine quietly logging the exact moment a signal disappeared. The closest thing this case has to a timestamp on the worst night of Nancy Guthrie's life. We're going to come back to that detail. Hold on to it. Now, here's where the case starts to get complicated, not because of what happened to Nancy but because of how the people investigating it have talked about it. Sheriff Chris Nanos, who leads the Pima County Sheriff's Department, has been the public face of this investigation from the beginning. And for 6 months, the story the public got was one of an active, ongoing search, surveillance images, DNA testing, repeated statements that the case was being worked hard. No suspect named. No arrests. But also, as far as anyone watching knew, no direct communication from whoever took her. Until the notes surfaced. Or rather, until the public learned that they had surfaced months earlier, quietly, and had been sitting with investigators the entire time. And that's the fault line. Not an accusation, a gap. Because here's what's actually on the record and what isn't. On the record, Sheriff Nanos on camera telling CBS News he had no note. On the record, his own department 1 day later releasing 2 of them to the public. What's not on the record anywhere from anyone? An explanation for that 24-hour reversal. Nothing confirms why the case was described one way on a Thursday and then backed by contradicting documents the very next day. Nobody's put that gap on record yet, not the sheriff, not the department, not the FBI. That doesn't mean something sinister happened in that gap. Investigators sometimes hold back what they know for good reason. A wrong word can tip off the wrong person or protect a detail only the real sender would know. But it does mean we're starting this story with a documented blind spot, not a resolved one. So keep 2 things in your head at once as we go forward. A grandmother with a heart condition, gone in the middle of the night. And a sheriff's department that told 2 different versions of the same story 24 hours apart, and hasn't yet told us why. According to the notes released by the Pima County Sheriff's Department, the first message arrived on February 2nd, 1 day after Nancy Guthrie was reported missing, sent through the tip line of KOLD-TV, the CBS affiliate in Tucson. It was addressed directly to Savannah Guthrie by name. Let's go through this one piece at a time, because the structure of this note tells you almost as much as the words in it. It opens by naming her. Not the family. Not whoever finds this. Savannah specifically by name, followed by a claim that Nancy was being held, that she was safe but scared, and that she'd be returned once payment was made. The note demanded $4 million paid in Bitcoin with a hard deadline. If that deadline passed, the number didn't disappear, it grew. $6 million with a new date attached. And underneath all of it, a threat stated plainly, if the money didn't come, Nancy wouldn't come home either. Here's the part that matters most, and it's easy to miss on a first read. The note didn't just make demands, it made promises. It said that once the ransom was paid, Nancy would be released within 12 hours, delivered to a so-called safe location back in Tucson. That's a level of specificity you don't get from someone bluffing. Real extortion attempts built entirely on fantasy tend to stay vague. Pay us and things will be fine. This note laid out a mechanism. A window. A location type. A process. And then there's the detail that reportedly moved this from concerning to credible in the eyes of investigators. According to reporting on the note's contents, the writer described 2 very specific things from inside Nancy's home. A white Apple Watch on the floor at the foot of her bed. And damage to a floodlight outside, near the back of the house. Think about what that means. Those aren't details a stranger reading the news coverage would know. At the time this note came in, 1 day after Nancy was reported missing, none of that had been made public. No press conference had described a smartwatch on a bedroom floor. Nobody had mentioned a broken floodlight in the backyard. For the FBI and Pima County investigators to take this note seriously enough to keep working it for 6 months, something in it had to match what they were actually seeing at the scene. And by every account since it did. That's the moment this stops being just a disturbing letter and becomes evidence. A watch on the floor. A light destroyed outside. Small, physical, unglamorous details, the kind you don't invent, you witness. The note closes on something colder than the ransom demand itself. A line telling the family not to involve law enforcement, warning that it wouldn't help them. And a final reminder, aimed squarely at Savannah and her siblings, that Nancy was aware of what was happening. That her life, as the note put it, was in their hands. So here's where Chapter 3 leaves us. 1 document. 1 deadline structure that escalates instead of softens. 2 physical details that reportedly lined up with the actual crime scene inside Nancy Guthrie's home. And a family, Savannah, Annie, and Cameron, suddenly holding something no family should ever have to hold. A piece of paper that might be their mother's kidnapper speaking directly to them, with just enough truth in it to make ignoring it impossible. We know what Note 1 said. We know it matched the scene. What we don't know yet, what nobody explained for 6 months, is what happened 4 days later when a second message arrived. And in that one, something changes. The money disappears from the conversation entirely. Hold on to that. We're coming back to it. Let's lay the timeline out minute by minute because this case only makes sense when you see it in sequence. 2:30 in the morning, January 31st into February 1st. That's the moment Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker lost its connection to her phone, the moment the device went out of range. Not a witness estimate. Not a guess based on when someone last texted her. A machine recording the second contact was lost. If investigators are right about what that signal means, this is the closest thing this case has to a timestamp on Nancy's abduction. February 1st. She's reported missing. February 2nd. 1 day later, the first note arrives. $4 million in Bitcoin. A deadline, 5 p.m. Thursday the 5th. That deadline passes. And true to what the note promised, the number doesn't shrink. It grows. $6 million now with a new deadline, 5 p.m. Monday the 9th. And this time, the note is explicit about what happens if that date comes and goes without payment. Nancy would be killed. February 6th, 4 days after the first note, 3 days before that second deadline, a second message arrives. Same tip line. Same television station. And this one doesn't ask for anything at all. That's the shape of the timeline. A signal cut at 2:30 a.m. A ransom that escalates instead of softens. A hard deadline for Nancy's life set for February 9th. And then, days before that deadline even arrives, a second note that changes everything about what this case is. We're going to go inside that second note next chapter in full. But first, there's something sitting in this timeline that needs to be said plainly, because it's the kind of thing true crime coverage usually either ignores or turns into an accusation. We're going to do neither. For 6 months, the public was told this case was active, being worked, moving forward, surveillance images, DNA testing, no suspect named. Then, on a Thursday, Sheriff Chris Nanos sat in front of CBS News and said he had no note. On Friday, his own department released 2 of them. Nothing on the record, not from Nanos, not from the Pima County Sheriff's Department, not from the FBI, explains why that 24-hour gap exists. We're not saying that gap proves a cover-up. We're not saying it proves negligence either. We're saying it's undocumented. As of this reporting, investigators have not said why the public description of this case changed overnight, and no reporter has gotten that question answered on the record. That's worth sitting with because it's going to matter again later, when we get to what Sheriff Nanos said about these notes' validity, and when we get to why this 6-month wait to release them happened at all. For now, remember the sequence. 2:30 a.m. February 2nd. February 5th. February 6th. February 9th. Because the note that came in on February 6th, the one that arrived 3 days before Nancy Guthrie was supposed to die by deadline, doesn't read like a ransom note at all. Before we go into what changed in the second note, we need to talk about who's been trying to explain the first one, because the notes themselves have already drawn outside analysis, and that analysis is worth hearing before we go further. Criminologist Dr. Casey Jordan appeared on CNN's Anderson Cooper 360 to walk through both messages after they were released. Her read wasn't about motive or identity, it was about the writing itself. She pointed to something specific, that both notes, despite being sent 4 days apart, carried the same rhythm, the same phrasing patterns, the same distance in tone. Her theory, and this is her theory stated on air, not a finding announced by investigators, is that the text may have been processed through AI. Not necessarily written from scratch by a machine, but run through one, which would explain why 2 messages sent days apart, under presumably very different emotional circumstances for whoever sent them, still sound like they came from the same source. That's worth taking seriously. It's also worth being precise about what it is. It's the read of one credentialed analyst, offered on a national news broadcast, based on the language patterns in 2 documents. It is not a forensic conclusion. It is not something the Pima County Sheriff's Department or the FBI has confirmed, endorsed, or even directly addressed. As of this reporting, no one from either agency has gone on record to support Dr. Jordan's theory, and no one from either agency has gone on record to dispute it either. There's no confirmed consensus here in either direction. That silence isn't evidence of anything on its own. It's just the honest state of what we know. Here's why that distinction matters, and why we're not going to let this become the center of the story before it's earned that place. An AI authorship theory is compelling because it explains something genuinely strange about these notes. The tonal consistency across 2 messages written under wildly different pressure. One note is a hostage negotiation. The other, as we're about to see, reads almost like something else entirely. If a human being wrote both, under real duress or real cruelty, you'd expect the language to shift more than it does. AI processing would explain that flatness. But would explain, isn't, does explain. There's another read entirely, that one person calm enough to plan an escalating ransom deadline days in advance, is simply disciplined and consistent by nature. That doesn't require artificial intelligence. It requires someone in control of themselves the entire time. We're not going to pretend to know which one is true. What we can tell you is this: 2 notes 4 days apart written by a person or people who, according to investigators, never changed IP addresses, never varied their channel, and never broke their tone. Whether that consistency comes from a machine or from a very specific kind of person is still an open question. And it's about to matter more than you think. Because in the second note, that consistency holds, but everything else about what's being said changes completely. According to the notes released by the Pima County Sheriff's Department, the second message arrived on February 6th, 4 days after the first, 3 days before Nancy Guthrie was supposed to die by the ransom deadline. Same channel. Same tip line at KOLD TV. Same family named directly. But everything else about it is different. The $4 million is gone. Not reduced. Not restructured. Gone. There's no new number, no new deadline, no Bitcoin address this time. A note that opened with a hostage negotiation 4 days earlier now reads like something else entirely. A confession or an apology depending on how much of it you're willing to believe. The note states that Nancy died shortly after she was taken. It attributes her death to her heart. Language that lines up chillingly with something we already know about her, the pacemaker, the condition she lived with every day. It says she's buried in nature now. And then it turns almost gently toward her children, telling them nothing they could have done would have changed the outcome and closing with an apology. Sit with the structure of that for a second because it matters. This isn't a note trying to extract anything anymore. There's no leverage left to protect, no deadline to enforce, no reason left to keep negotiating, if the person writing it is telling the truth. Retired FBI agent Jason Pack, who reviewed both notes on the record, pointed out exactly this. People motivated by money don't walk away from $4 million when a plan falls apart. They try to salvage something. This note asks for nothing at all. Around this same window, the sheriff's department released something else, doorbell camera footage from Nancy's home. In its own release, the department described 2 videos that, in its words, may be from 2 separate days showing an unidentified male. That's the department's own language, not a neighbor's account, not a tip line rumor. 2 videos, possibly 2 different days. One unidentified man. We don't know yet if that man has anything to do with the notes. We don't know if he's connected to Nancy's disappearance at all, or if he's someone the investigation has already looked at and moved past. What we know is what the sheriff's office itself has said. The footage exists, it may span 2 separate days, and the person in it has not been identified. So here's where Chapter 6 leaves us. A note that started as a hostage negotiation ends 4 days later as something closer to a eulogy. A ransom that vanished instead of growing. And a piece of footage, confirmed by the department that released it, of a man nobody's been able to name. 2 documents. Same sender according to the IP data. 2 completely different intentions. And that's exactly where this case stops being simple. According to the note broken down in Chapter 3, the first message came in on February 2nd, opening with a name, a demand, and a deadline. According to the note broken down in Chapter 6, the second came in 4 days later, dropping every trace of that demand and replacing it with an apology. 2 documents. 2 completely different intentions. And according to CBS News reporting this week, both of them came from the same IP address. That single fact changes what kind of story this is. Investigators familiar with the case told CBS that the address was masked, routed through something that hid the sender's identity, so law enforcement still doesn't know whose device sent either message. But they do know this. Whoever sent the first note promising Nancy's safe return for $4 million is the same person or people who sent the second, telling her family she was already dead. Retired FBI Supervisory Special Agent Jason Pack reviewed both notes on the record, and his read is direct. Same channel. Same habits. Same distance from responsibility. In his assessment, this points to one person writing both messages. And he zeroes in on the detail that should stop you cold. Nobody who's actually holding a person for $4 million in ransom just walks away from that number when things don't go as planned. Real extortion doesn't quietly disappear. It adjusts, threatens, negotiates, tries something else. This didn't. The money simply stopped being mentioned. So if Pack is right, there are 2, and only 2 ways to read what happened here, and both of them are sourced, not speculated. The first, this is the actual person or people responsible for Nancy's disappearance. Someone who genuinely intended to collect a ransom and when, for whatever reason, that plan collapsed, told the truth about what happened to her. Under this reading, the specific details in Note 1, the watch, the floodlight, aren't just convincing. They're confirmation. This is someone who was there. The second, this is someone else entirely. Someone who never had Nancy but who had access to details close enough to the investigation or lucky enough in their guesses to be taken seriously, and who used that access to insert themselves into a national story first for money, then, when that didn't materialize, for something else. Attention. Control. The last word. The notes themselves don't resolve which of those 2 people we're dealing with. The IP address doesn't either. It confirms one sender, not one identity, and not one motive. What we're left with is this. One offender telling a grieving family 2 different versions of the worst news imaginable 4 days apart. Either they're telling the truth about all of it, or they're telling the truth about none of it. And for 6 months, nobody outside a small circle of investigators knew this contradiction even existed. So where does the sheriff's office actually stand on all of this? When CBS News asked Sheriff Chris Nanos directly about the notes' legitimacy, his answer was careful, almost procedural. Those hostage notes, are they valid? Do we believe they're valid? We think every one of them's valid until we show otherwise. That's not a confirmation that these notes came from Nancy's actual abductor. It's a working assumption stated on the record from the man leading the investigation. Treat it as real unless something proves it isn't. That framing matters because it tells you how the department has been operating behind the scenes, even during the 6 months they said nothing publicly. Every note, presumed credible until disproven. Every claim worked, not dismissed. Let's be precise about what's actually confirmed here, what's still a claim, and what's still an open question. Confirmed with a clear chain of custody. Both notes were sent through the tip line at KOLD-TV, the CBS affiliate in Tucson, first on February 2nd, then again on February 6th. The FBI, working alongside the Pima County Sheriff's Department, treated both as connected to Nancy's disappearance from the moment they arrived. CBS News reporting, citing investigators familiar with the case, confirmed both were sent from the same IP address. That's 3 points of contact: KOLD-TV, the sheriff's office, the FBI, all tracking the same 2 documents through an established, reportable chain. Now here's what stays outside that chain and why we're keeping it there. Separately, there's a reported third message, a note that reportedly came in through a different channel, and reportedly from a different IP address than the first 2, though allegedly routed through the same kind of anonymizing service. This detail comes from local reporting, not from a sheriff's office statement, and its place in the actual timeline, when exactly it arrived, whether it predates or follows the 2 confirmed notes, whether investigators consider it connected at all, isn't established in what's currently on the record. We're not going to fold that third message into the same IP story we just walked through. It doesn't fit cleanly, and pretending it does would be exactly the kind of overreach that erodes trust in reporting like this. So we're flagging it plainly as a loose thread, something reported, something unconfirmed, something that may or may not belong to this case at all. What we can say with confidence is this: 2 notes, 1 IP address, 1 sheriff who's told the public he treats every one of them as real until proven otherwise. That's the official position on the record from the person running this investigation. What we can't say yet is whether real means what it sounds like it should mean: a genuine abductor telling the truth in stages, or someone else close enough to the case to be believed. Either way, the sheriff's office isn't ruling anything out. Neither should we. Somewhere underneath every deadline, every IP address, every analyst theory in this case, there's an 84-year-old woman with a heart condition, who wore a pacemaker so her family could rest a little easier. That device is the reason anyone can point to 2:30 in the morning and say, here, this is likely when it happened. It wasn't built to solve a crime. It was built to keep Nancy Guthrie alive a little longer. And in the end, it may be the only witness that night had. Savannah Guthrie has spent 6 months speaking for her mother, because her mother hasn't been able to speak for herself. In March, she told the public plainly that she believed the notes were genuine, that her family had read them and responded to them hoping for some kind of answer back. None came. Just silence on the other end of whatever channel they were reaching into. Then, in July, 6 months to the day since Nancy disappeared, Savannah posted again. Not a statement crafted for cameras. Something quieter. She wrote that there's a way to end this and asked whoever's out there to do the right thing. She wrote that her family will never stop looking for answers, never stop looking for the light, no matter what the circumstances say about how likely that light is to still be there. That's not a detail we're adding for effect. That's a woman, 6 months into not knowing whether her mother is alive or buried somewhere she'll never find her, still choosing to ask instead of accuse. Still leaving the door open for whoever did this to walk back through it. And here's what's actually happening on the other side of that door right now, while the public waits along with her. No suspect has been named. The FBI is still working through the language in both notes, trying to pull something out of the phrasing itself that might point to a real person. And the doorbell footage, the 2 videos possibly from 2 separate days showing a man nobody's identified, is still being analyzed. 3 separate processes, running quietly in parallel to a family's grief. No suspect. A linguistic review that hasn't finished. A face that hasn't been named. None of them resolved. All of them, as far as anyone outside the investigation knows, still open. That's the part of this case that doesn't fit neatly into a note or an IP address or a deadline on a page. Somewhere between the $4 million demand and the apology that followed it, a family has had to keep living. Savannah still shows up to work. Annie and Cameron still wake up every day without their mother. And every one of them is doing that while carrying 2 documents that either tell them the worst thing that could be true, or don't. We don't know which yet. Neither do they. Let's be precise about what's actually confirmed here, what's still a claim and what's still pure theory. 6 chapters of contradictions, timelines, and quotes deserve a moment where we lay it all out flat, no rhetoric, just what we know and where it came from. Confirmed. Both notes, the one demanding $4 million and the one that told the Guthrie family Nancy had died, were sent from the same IP address. That's not speculation. That's CBS News citing investigators familiar with the case, reporting it directly. One sender or one group behind both messages. Confirmed. The Pima County Sheriff's Department released the full text of both notes to the public on July 31st, per its own official statement, 6 months after Nancy Guthrie disappeared. That release wasn't leaked. It wasn't extracted through a records request. The department chose to make this public in its own words, hoping someone would recognize the writing. Confirmed. The day before that release, Sheriff Chris Nanos told CBS News on camera, "I have nothing to indicate she's dead. I don't have a body. I don't have a burial site. I don't have any note." That's not a paraphrase. That's the quote, and it's the quote that opened this entire episode. 24 hours later, his department released 2. Now the claim tier. Retired FBI Supervisory Special Agent Jason Pack reviewed both notes and gave his professional read. Same channel, same habits, same distance from responsibility. In his assessment, one person likely wrote both messages, and the disappearance of the ransom demand in Note 2 isn't the behavior of someone still trying to collect $4 million. That's a trained analyst's conclusion stated on the record. It is not a confirmed fact from the sheriff's office or the FBI's official case file. Treat it exactly as what it is, an expert claim worth weighing seriously, not yet proven. Next tear down, theory. Criminologist Dr. Casey Jordan on CNN floated the idea that both notes may have been processed through AI, which would explain why the tone stays so consistent across two messages sent under presumably very different circumstances. That's a theory. One analyst, one broadcast appearance, zero confirmation or denial from either investigating agency. We're not treating it as more than that, and neither should you. And finally, the piece we're not folding into any of this. There's a separately reported third message, allegedly sent from a different IP address than the first two, allegedly routed through a similar kind of anonymizing service. Where it fits in the timeline, whether investigators consider it connected to the two confirmed notes at all, isn't established anywhere in current, reliable reporting. It stays exactly where we've kept it since Chapter 8, unconfirmed, unclear, and separate from the spine of this story. So here's the ledger plainly. Two notes. One IP address. One sheriff who said he had nothing, one day before his department proved otherwise. That's what's confirmed. Layered on top of it, one expert's read that this is a single author telling two different truths, and one theory that a machine may have helped write both. Layered outside of it entirely, a third message that may or may not belong in this story at all. That's not a conclusion. That's just an honest accounting of where 6 months of investigation and 1 week of new reporting have actually left us. So here's where this leaves us. Two notes. One IP address, masked well enough that 6 months of investigation still hasn't traced it to a name. A sheriff who told the public he had nothing, one day before proving otherwise. A ransom demand that vanished entirely between message 1 and message 2. And a family, Savannah, Annie, and Cameron Guthrie, who have spent half a year not knowing whether the second note is the truth, or whether it's cruelty wearing the shape of a confession. The Pima County Sheriff's Department made a specific choice when they released these notes on July 31st. They didn't release them because the case had broken open. They released them because it hadn't, because 6 months of forensic work, surveillance footage, and DNA testing had not produced a name, and because somewhere out there, the department believes, is a person who's heard this exact phrasing before. A coworker. A family member. Someone online. Someone who read these words and felt something click. That's not a metaphor. That's the actual stated reason the department gave for going public. The hope that the distinctive linguistic characteristics, as they put it, in these notes would ring a bell for someone who isn't part of this investigation at all. So we're going to ask you the same question the sheriff's office is asking, because there's a real chance the answer is sitting in this comment section right now. Read back through what these notes actually said. Hello Savannah, we have your mother. The specific mention of the watch on the floor. The line about the floodlight. And then, 4 days later, the shift. We never intended to hurt her. She is buried in nature now. Nothing you could have done could have changed the outcome. Does any of that sound like something you've heard before? Not the broad strokes, the phrasing. The particular way certain words got used. Someone who talks like this in a group chat, on a message board, in an old email. It doesn't have to feel dramatic to matter. It just has to be specific. Here's what's still open and who's actually responsible for closing it. The Pima County Sheriff's Department is still working through tips coming in following the July 31st release. That review is active right now as this video goes up. The FBI is still conducting a linguistic and forensic analysis of both notes, trying to extract something from the writing itself that a human ear might miss. Neither of those processes has a public end date. Neither agency has said when or if they expect a resolution. No suspect has been named. No arrest has been made. The man in the doorbell footage, the one the department itself said may appear across 2 separate days, still doesn't have an identity attached to him. That's the honest state of this case, 6 months and 1 contradiction-filled week later. Not solved. Not close to solved as far as anything on the record shows. Just a family still waiting, an investigation still working 2 separate forensic threads at once, and 2 documents sitting out in public now hoping the right person reads them. If you know something, even something that feels too small to matter, that's exactly the kind of detail these investigators are asking for. Not certainty. Just recognition. Subscribe and stay with us for what comes next in this case, because there's a real chance the answer to who wrote these notes doesn't come from a lab. It comes from someone watching this exact video. Let's go back to where we started. I have nothing to indicate she's dead. I don't have a body. I don't have a burial site. I don't have any note. Sheriff Chris Nanos said that on camera to CBS News on a Thursday. By Friday, the Pima County Sheriff's Department had released 2. We've spent this entire episode inside those 2 documents, inside a $4 million demand that grew to 6, inside a 12-hour promise of return, inside a watch on a bedroom floor and a floodlight destroyed out back. We've sat inside the second note too, the one that arrived 4 days later and took all of it back. No ransom. No deadline. Just an apology, and a claim that Nancy Guthrie's heart gave out shortly after she was taken, and that she's buried somewhere in nature now. We've heard from Jason Pack, who believes the silence around the missing ransom demand tells you something real about who wrote this. We've heard from Dr. Casey Jordan, who wonders if a machine helped shape the words themselves. We've laid out, plainly, what's confirmed: the shared IP address, the July 31st release, Nanos' own contradicted quote, and what's still just a theory nobody's proven either way. And after all of that, here's where we still are. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She has a heart condition. She has 3 children, Savannah, Annie, and Cameron, who have spent 6 months not knowing which version of their mother's story is true. The one where someone somewhere still has her. Or the one where she's already gone, and someone finally decided to say so. 2 notes. 1 sender according to the IP data. 2 completely different truths and no way yet to know which one, if either, is real. That's not a satisfying place to end an episode. It's not supposed to be. Because this isn't over. There's no verdict here, no arrest, no name attached to the man in that doorbell footage. Just the sheriff's department still working tips, an FBI still combing through the language of 2 documents, and a family still waiting on both. So we're going to leave you exactly where the Pima County Sheriff's Department left the public on July 31st, with the words themselves and a question about whether you've heard them before. Hello Savannah, we have your mother. We never intended to hurt her, that was not our intention. She is buried in nature now. Read that again. Not for the shock of it, for the specificity of it. Somebody wrote those exact words, in that exact order, and whoever they are, they've been walking around for 6 months carrying that. If any of that phrasing has ever crossed your path, a message, a post, a conversation that used language like this, that carried this same rhythm, this same strange calm in the middle of describing someone's death, that's what the Pima County Sheriff's Department and the FBI are asking you to bring forward. Not a theory. Not a guess. Just recognition. Because somewhere out there, someone already knows how this ends. We'll be back the moment that changes.